Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. The webinar is beginning. My name is Chris Wilson. I'm the Communications Director here at the Dallas-Fort Worth Hospital Council. Thank you for being here today for this webinar hosted in coordination with Alexion Pharmaceuticals Incorporated. They're an associate member of the council. Today's topic is Andexanet alfa, budget impact model. This should be a great discussion detailing ANDEXXA, a groundbreaking antidote that has been in the headlines since its approval in 2018. Using an approved model developed with clinical guidance and in accordance with best practices, our speakers today will lead a discussion on the cost effectiveness and budgetary impact of ANDEXXA on health outcomes and costs. Today we have Kelly McNeil-Posey, Director of Health Economics and Outcomes Research at Alexion, and Sharon Williams, Director of Strategic Accounts at Alexion, and they will serve as our speakers. Their company, Alexion, is a global biopharmaceutical company focused on the discovery, development, and commercialization of medicines for severe and life-threatening rare disorders. The company was established in 1992 and is headquartered in Boston. We are looking forward to their presentation. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, here's Kelly McNeil-Posey.
Hello and thank you, and welcome all to our webinar today. I am Kelly McNeil-Posey, a registered nurse by background, serving in the role as Director of Health, Economics, and Outcomes Research. It is my job to do data generation and data dissemination. I am housed in Dallas, Texas, so one of your very own, and it is my pleasure to serve the West with such data. Along with me is my partner, Sharon Williams, who will give more background on her alignment. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for allowing us to address you today. As Kelly mentioned, my name is Sharon Williams, and I am part of U.S. Strategic Accounts. And what my colleagues and I am also joined by two strategic account directors that are in the audience that cover the Dallas-Fort Worth area, Dina Kreitzer and Dan Coburn, and collectively, along with others across the country, we help institutions and integrated delivery systems, health systems, better understand how to access Alexion products by understanding reimbursement pathways, by understanding protocols, and ultimately getting patients to the therapy that they need. And I'll turn it back over to you, Kelly.
Thank you. So without further ado, we will enter the model. And I must read the disclaimer that this model evaluates the cost effectiveness and budgetary impact of Andexanet alfa on selected health outcomes and costs. An appropriate model structure has been developed in collaboration with clinical guidance and in accordance with the best practices outlined by the International Society of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research, otherwise known as ISPOR. Model parameters are based on review of published literature and other cited references. Where published data were not available, assumptions have been made used to guide model development. Results may not generalize to treatment settings, populations, and individuals that may have different characteristics from those included in the analysis. And for the purposes of this analysis, we will focus on intracranial hemorrhage. Relative to the important safety information, Andexanet is also known as ANDEXXA, coagulation factor 10A recombinant inactivated ZHZO. It is a recombinant modified human factor 10A protein indicated for patients treated with rivaroxaban or apixaban when reversal of anticoagulation is needed due to life-threatening or uncontrolled bleeding. This indication is approved under accelerated approval based on the change from baseline in anti-10A activity in healthy volunteers. An improvement in hemostasis has not been established. Continued approval for this indication may be contingent upon the results of studies that demonstrate an improvement in hemostasis in patients. In terms of limitations, ANDEXXA has not been shown to be effective for and is not indicated for the treatment of bleeding related to any factor 10A inhibitors other than apixaban or rivaroxaban. In terms of the warning, thromboembolic risk, ischemic risk, cardiac arrest, and sudden deaths, treatment with ANDEXXA has been associated with serious and life-threatening adverse events, including arterial and venous thromboembolic events, ischemic events including MI and ischemic stroke, cardiac arrest, and sudden deaths. Monitor for thromboembolic events and initiate anticoagulation when medically appropriate. Monitor for symptoms and signs that precede cardiac arrest and provide treatment as needed. So moving into the model, the decision problem here is you're looking at reversal relative to a related intracranial hemorrhage using the strategies of direct reversal with Andexanet alfa or usual care to include PCC, prothrombin complex concentrate. Andexanet alfa and PCC will be used. This model framework, we are going to focus on the acute care side, which is the budget impact model. And for purposes of the conversation, we will restrict it to the acute phase. You'll see the decision tree. We're also going to only be concerned with the United States. And the model allows for the inclusion, exclusion, indirect productivity loss. However, for in time horizon, that's more long-term, and we'll table it for this discussion. In terms of the setting, this is assuming a larger population base of 10,000, cohort age at 80, cost of effectiveness analysis, if you were looking long-term, would be 20, and then the costs and outcomes, again, this is more of the long-term model. In terms of the acute phase, when you're looking at Andexanet alfa and PCC, we took into effect the clinical considerations of hematoma expansion in the intracranial space. The figures that you see here are derived from referenced models. And according to hematoma expansion, what we do know, and it absolutely is intuitive, if you expand within the intracranial space, you can absolutely understand the increase in morbidity and mortality, as well as quite possibly the need for neurosurgical intervention. 30-day readmission, 30-day mortality, as well as ICU stay. So all of this was referenced and sourced through cited material. And here you can see hematoma expansion for Andexanet alfa is quoted as being 12.5% and PCC at 31.8%. Relative to the expansion and looking at the sources that we have, neurosurgical intervention happens about 8.9% of the time in Andexanet alfa, 19.4% of the time with PCCs. 30-day readmission, we were unable to really tie any appropriate references to either of the two, so that's blank for now, but can be populated in the near future. 30-day mortality, the differences you see here as 15.3 compared to 48.9. Relative to hematoma expansion, it actually does drive mechanical ventilation. Through a study out of Columbia in around 2013, it showed a link to mechanical ventilation relative to expansion, that you are 82% more likely to need mechanical ventilation should you expand, versus if there is no expansion beyond the original insult, that risk is 32%. In terms of ICU length of stay, hematoma expansion is associated with a longer length of stay, which makes sense. And this is quoted as being 8 compared to 4 if you do not expand. In terms of functional outcomes, this is modeled after the ischemic model, and we won't go through it completely, but it absolutely makes sense that if you don't have disability to begin with and less expansion, there's less of a cost with a functional score at 0 where there's no disability compared to the increased cost if there is disability. In staying with the medical, we're going to look at the different acute phase unit costs. And these are actually sourced from Medicare data from 2010 and looking at the ICU cost of stay at $56.93 and the additional cost of mechanical ventilation. And while this absolutely may vary from state to state and certainly from different hospital systems, it's important to know that this is at least a costly measure that you would all agree that there are costs associated when there's higher care that's required, as well as mechanical ventilation. Readmission absolutely has a cost, but this will not be included, but it's just a reminder that with readmission comes additional cost. And the need for neurosurgical intervention was sourced from a 2015 reference that gave us a ballpark figure for neurosurgical intervention. And again, you can see here the rehabilitation costs where we're looking at the long-term model. In terms of pharmacy cost, this is the primary intervention drug acquisition cost. For Andexanet alfa, we're looking at wholesale acquisition costs, and we're looking at a blended approach of the low dose being 80% of the time, and then the higher dose, which has a higher cost at 20% of the time. And then the low dose being 880, and then the high dose per milligram would be 1760. Looking at the wholesale acquisition without rebates, but including the new technology add-on payment, you end up with a value for mean cost of therapy at around $11,286. The cost here for additional therapy is really driven from real-world data that has helped to show us that it's not necessarily a significant driver in this model, but you can see the differences of additional therapy for these agents that are listed. But what's important to understand is that Andexanet alfa as a direct antidote is generally thought of and used as monotherapy compared to the PCC arm, which is generally polypharmacy. And you have the subsequent cost, again, from one of the real world data sources. Before going any further beyond Andexanet mean cost of therapy, I would ask that my colleague, Sharon Williams, go more in depth with the new technology add-on payment and its value. Sharon?
Thank you, Kelly. I'd like to add some additional comments regarding NTAP. So the new technology add-on payment, or NTAP, was implemented by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, otherwise known as CMS, to ensure that traditional fee-for-service Medicare beneficiaries have access to breakthrough technologies, including drug therapies. So to qualify for the designation, the technology must be a substantial improvement over existing options. The technology must be new, and the existing MSDRG, or Medicare Severity Diagnostic Related Group payment involving the technology must be inadequate. So recently, CMS proposed extending the NTAP designations for an additional year for those technologies expiring in 2021. So that proposal is currently pending comment, and CMS will render a decision following the provisional comment period. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Kelly.
All right, thank you. So recognizing that the mean cost of therapy here is impacted by that value, you can see that the cost is $11,286. Moving down to the usual care of PCC, it is a weighted calculation. Here we shows a mean weight of 85 kilos, the indicated dose per label, which is 50, wholesale acquisition costs without rebates, and additional cost of therapy, because it's generally not used alone, here is $11,613. And I've explained this box down here in terms of the additional therapies relative to an Andexanet alfa and PCC, other agents that may or may not be used. Now, in terms of cost consequence and not adding any rebates, here we're just looking at the 30-day hospitalization costs per index for intracranial hemorrhage. So looking at this as one patient, for instance, if you're looking at the blended cost of the $29,000 for Andexanet alfa, the PCC cost and the difference, you can see the difference in wholesale acquisition. But in an effort not to look at that in a value, you can also consider the clinical costs, which are often the costly items of ICU, mechanical ventilation, and neurosurgery. Again, readmission and rebate are not included, but it's helpful to now understand through the lens that Sharon Williams presented that here you have a subtotal that is currently offset by the new technology add-on payment. So the difference in values shows the valuable asset that the NTAP brings. When you look at Andexanet alfa versus the PCCs, lives saved per 50 is 16.82. In terms of the incremental ICU days avoided per 50 patients, 38.6. And this is pretty impactful when you're looking at the number needed to treat to save a life based on the parameters that we've used is 2.97. So I will stop here and then just ask a few questions if we can open up the mic. So one, given that this is intracranial hemorrhage, Are these the appropriate variables to use for such a model? Or the chat function, whichever you prefer. Understanding and having feedback relative to the variables that have been used is helpful. I can tell you that more often when this has been presented across the United States, it has been agreed that ICU days, mechanical ventilation, the ones that we have, it absolutely makes sense because those are some of the financial drivers relative to what happens for a patient that continues to have intracranial expansion. All right, seeing no questions for that or any interaction, I would ask, secondly, were you aware of the economic impact of the new technology add-on payment in TAP? And feel free to use the chat if you would like. And I think Sharon Williams gave a very good background relative to the new technology add-on payment in terms of its impact and also recognizing it as a therapy that was considered new technology to be made available on a broader scale through reimbursement strategies. And then thirdly, I would ask you to consider, is this model useful as it stands today? Where I can say that this has been useful is when you're looking through the process of adoption and looking at pharmacy costs to what it looks at in terms of overall treatment for a patient and cost avoidance. It has been extremely useful to look at it through the lens of outcome and the investment in using something acutely that absolutely impacts the hospital bottom line in a favorable way for lives saved, morbidity saved, and also in terms of the resource utilization. All right, Chris, those are the questions and the content that I have. Do you see any questions from the audience that we can address?
Sure, hold on here, let me check. And we would like to ask the audience, if you do have questions, to type them in there to the question box or the chat box. Okay, we have one here. Which hospitals qualify for NTAP?
That is a new technology add-on payment. Yes, and I would say Sharon. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. The NTAP payment, to be eligible, it applies to Medicare qualified acute care hospitals that are paid via the inpatient prospective payment system. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
How many years? Here's another one. How many years will NTAP apply?
So once a product has received the designation for NTAP, the new technology add-on payment, that is a 3-year program. And as mentioned earlier, this is the first time that CMS has ever considered extending that for an additional year for those therapies or technologies that would expire in 2021. The new provisionary period, if it is approved, or provision if it is approved, would affect fiscal year 2022.
Okay, anyone in the audience, if you want to ask a question, please type it in. Okay, here's another one. When is CMS expected to issue a decision on the extension of NTAP designations due to expire in 2021?
We're expecting that decision to come at sometime in the third quarter of this year. And like I said, when it does come, if it's favorable, it would go into effect for the fiscal year 2022. So hopefully that answers that question.
And what I would ask the audience, if there's any additional questions that you may have, we're happy to field that relative to the data and the commercial NTAP, if that would be helpful. So certainly please send your questions our way.
Yeah, we would like to note this session is being recorded and it will be posted online for those of you who would like to see it or might have come on late. I'm also going to have a PDF of the presentation that I'll send out to everyone who registered today, and with the contact information of our speakers and representatives from Alexion. I believe that's all we have for the moment. Kelly and Sharon, did y'all have any closing thoughts?
Well, I would just like to say thank you for your attention and taking the time out of your day. We certainly appreciate your attention, and I'm very happy to, go deeper into any of the data that was presented today. My contact information will be with Chris. So thank you for the opportunity. Sharon?
Yes, I would also like to add my thank yous for that, and on behalf of Dina Kreitzer and Dan Coburn, again, in the audience. And I would like to say, if you have additional questions after considering the information that was presented today, and you want to reach out to any of us that are on the line today representing Alexion, Chris will have your contact information, and as he mentioned, he will be sending that out. We would be more than happy to discuss in greater details some of those questions that that this presentation may have left you with, or that come to mind afterwards. So again, thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Great. Thank you, Kelly and Sharon. We really appreciate it. This has really been an interesting webinar, and I'll make sure that we send it out to everyone who registered, and we really appreciate your presentation today.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our attendees.
All right. Take care.